Well, let's begin by saying that it's not really unexpected that this happened. All of the signs were already presented that if Constantinople went forward and proceeded with its plan to grant autocephaly to the church in Ukraine, that Moscow was going to resist. There was a short time I thought that they might adopt a different strategy, and I wasn't the only one. There were a few people saying that perhaps Moscow would grant their own Tomos of Autocephaly to the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. In fact, that's an important historical point, because in 1991 and 1992, in a very short period of time, when now Patriarch Filaret of the Kyivan Patriarchate was the Metropolitan of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, they wrote a letter with the signatures of the entire episcopate requesting autocephaly from Moscow. And they repeated this request in 91 and then again in 92. And the second request included a protest against some of the information that Moscow had publicized concerning Filaret. So all of the bishops signed that document as well. And what happened was that they didn't respond, and this is 26 years later. So obviously, we all know what happened in those 26 years with Filaret joining the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, the Kyivan Patriarchate. Emerging from that, there being 3 churches in Ukraine. And throughout this time, there has been opportunity for Moscow to address this issue, and there have been reports that Patriarch Alexy II was interested, that he was not completely turned off to autocephaly for the church in Ukraine, but nothing ever transpired. So we have to keep in mind that in 1996, something similar happened, a sort of a preview of what we're seeing today, and that this is the situation in Estonia, when the Ecumenical Patriarchate acted to establish its own Exarchate there. And Moscow's reaction at the time was exactly the same as it is now. They ceased commemorating the Patriarch of Constantinople in their liturgies. This is a practice that dates to antiquity. In fact, I was checking the history today. We see that removal of the name from the diptychs, not even permitting people to pray quietly, is something that originates from late antiquity as a way to demonstrate that the communion between the churches is fragile. So in 96, this was essentially a preview of what might happen. And I would also say that this has been percolating for quite some time. In the post-World War II era, after the Russian church itself suffered immeasurably under Soviet persecution, as did the Ukrainian church, they embarked on an internationalization campaign. And what we see is that the Moscow Patriarchate at that time, now having permission to exist, which doesn't mean that they were flourishing. I'm certainly not saying that they were granted special privileges, because that wouldn't be fair to their own history. But they did grant autocephaly to several churches, the church in Poland, the church of Czechoslovakia, and the church in America. And at the time, they never asked for an assembly of all of the heads of the Orthodox churches to collaborate or to deliberate this issue, which is what they're asking for now, nor did they ask Constantinople for permission or even for consultation on the issue. They simply acted unilaterally. And then finally in 2016, you have a very long planned Holy and Great Council in Crete that Constantinople had prepared for decades. And at the last, there were signals that churches weren't going to participate. The Georgian and Bulgarian churches are quite conservative. The Church of Antioch has a long-standing disagreement with the Church of Constantinople concerning a couple of parishes in Qatar. So there were some issues there as well. But when Moscow withdrew, that was a big blow to how one might interpret the significance of that gathering in 2016. And I think it's important to note that in 1990 and in 1995, the Constantinopolitan Church received first the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Canada, as is probably well known to people who are listening here, and also then the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in the USA. And I don't know if this is well known or not, but the Moscow Patriarchate protested vehemently Constantinople's reception of these churches, especially the one in the USA, because this was the church that had been headed by Mstislav Skripnik, Patriarch Mstyslav, and he was a thorn in the side for decades of the Moscow Patriarchate, especially after the Autocephalous Church emerged and he was elected its first patriarch. Now, note that historically speaking, there was some initial hesitation on the part of other Orthodox churches, a question of, well, what should we do? Does this mean that we can now celebrate Eucharist with these churches? Does this mean, and there were some pastors who just weren't sure what to do. But ultimately, that blew over. Now, these are all on a smaller scale than what we're seeing now. The stakes are much higher for Moscow with Constantinople. But I think that what we need to keep in mind is a couple of different things. First, this is probably going to go on for a while. I don't think there's going to be a quick fix solution to this. I don't think it's going to stop Constantinople's process of organizing a council in Ukraine to establish the new church and to elect a patriarch or a metropolitan, and then to establish a synod of bishops. I don't think it's going to stop that. That process it would be very difficult to reverse that process for now. And I do think that this will probably go on for a while, but we should note that in Moscow's announcement that they did not cease Eucharistic concelebration with Constantinople. So this is just a first step. And depending on how all of this unfolds, it could go on for a while. And what could result is that we might see that some churches might be hesitant to recognize the newly established Orthodox Church in Ukraine. It's very difficult to predict. That you'll find predictions online. I do think that eventually most of the Orthodox churches in the world will accept that church as canonical, especially since Constantinople has been very carefully developing a case for finally correcting the canonical irregularities in the churches in Ukraine. And among the things that were surprising in the information that they've been publishing online was that people have known for a long time that Constantinople did not officially recognize the Autocephalous Church and the Kyivan Patriarchate. But when they mentioned at the recent synaxis earlier in September, in the course of the speeches that were delivered, that the church under Moscow is not canonical. It has a very irregular status. You know, its current status is a church with broad autonomy and self-governing. This is a made-up status. It was granted in 1990. It went from being an exarchate of the Moscow Patriarchate to having this sort of odd canonical status that is somewhere in between an exarchate and an autocephalous church. Now, in 1918, the Ukrainian church in Kyiv voted officially for autonomy, and that vote was accepted by the Moscow Council. And so for some reason in 1990, they didn't revert to complete autonomy, which is just one step below autocephaly, but instead they voted for this made-up canonical status. And Constantinople has also presented their case that the church in Ukraine, that Moscow in 1686 was never actually granted complete jurisdiction over the Kyivan Metropolia, but only had the right to ordain the Metropolitan of Kyiv, who then still had the responsibility of commemorating the Patriarch of Constantinople as his patriarch, which symbolizes the relationship between the two churches. So, you know, a lot of what's going on here is you have two colliding interpretations of the history of the Kyivan Metropolia. And first, Constantinople is reclaiming Ukraine as its canonical territory. Why are they doing this? It is my opinion that they are doing this because for 26 years, Moscow has had the opportunity to resolve this schism, and they have not. And neither have the Ukrainians come together on their own without asking anyone for help to hold an all-Ukrainian council that might resolve this problem. So Constantinople recognizes that there are millions of Orthodox Christians, a growing number, who are not in the canonical church and are acting, and in their mind, acting pastorally to correct this problem and to reunite these people with the canonical church, with the presumption that people who wish to remain in the Moscow Patriarchate, that this privilege will be honored in Ukraine. And while this is also irregular, it's not unprecedented. It's very similar to what we have in countries like Canada and the United States, where we have lots of Orthodox churches existing side by side, and we're in communion with one another, but we're not one completely unified body, meaning that there's one bishop over everyone in each city. So that's Constantinople's attempt to resolve this situation. Moscow's interpretation is different. Moscow interprets the situation of the Kyivan Metropolia as in 1686 that Constantinople did grant complete jurisdiction to Moscow, and when they took that action, that this was a reunion of the peoples of Kiev and Rus who had once been together. And this has been part of Russian Orthodox and really Russian political ideology for quite some time, that there is one people, один народ, and this one people should be in one church. Now, certainly there are Ukrainians who have subscribed to this, and this statement can be found in the interview published on the Moscow Patriarchal website by Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev. He says quite clearly that this was a reunion of those peoples, and in a certain sense it fits with all of the statements that have been made by the Moscow Patriarchate now, really for the better part of approximately 50 to 60 years, pretty much since the Cold War started, when West Ukraine was added to the Soviet Union at the Yalta Agreement in 1945, and then the Soviet Union dissolved the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church and interpreted that as the reunion of former Greek Catholics with the Orthodox Church, that this was the reunion of Ukrainians and Russians into one big East Slavic family. This is all located in the Ruski Mir ideology, and one might even call initiative, that was pretty much started anew. It didn't originate with Patriarch Kirill, but he renewed it in 2009 as a way to have the Moscow Patriarchate be the church home for all of these different places. And here's the crucial part. Kyiv, in this narrative, is the religious cell of the Moscow Patriarchate. It is the mother of Russian cities. If Kyiv is now the capital of an Autocephalous Church of Ukraine, and it will be shortly, barring something completely unforeseen happening, that long-standing narrative is challenged. And I think this explains why Moscow has responded with such swiftness and such ferocity. On the other hand, I don't think that the Ecumenical Patriarchate is going to back away one bit from this proclamation. And what's going to transpire is that for Orthodox in Ukraine, it's going to be tense for a while. The two churches are going to have to exist side by side, and they're going to have to find a way. And the first thing you're going to notice is that there will be accusations about taking property. And so prudence will be required, especially on the part of the new Autocephalous Church, to be careful in the way that they handle this, the kinds of public statements that they make. And one also should keep an eye on accusations, public accusations, of attempts to steal church property, because this has been going on ever since the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church returned to Ukraine. And that quieted down somewhat. But these accusations have been made, certainly in the last few years, that the Kyivan Patriarchate is trying to steal parishes and parish property that belongs to the Moscow Patriarchate. So they're reclaiming a martyr identity that they're the ones who are being persecuted, and that fits squarely with the idea of an Autocephalous church being a state project, where when you study the history, it's not so much a state project that's gone back and forth in terms of the state's privileging or favoring of one church over another. This has long been the desire to restore the Kyivan Metropolia, this time as an Autocephalous church instead of a de facto Autocephalous church under Constantinople. So there's a really long history here. It's not a new invention. And the ideology of a Moscow Patriarchate being a multinational church with Kyiv as its center, particularly as its spiritual center, the place of pilgrimages, the place with the oldest lavra. You know, these are things that when they're challenged, when narratives are challenged, the people who are the current caretakers of the narrative are going to resist and respond swiftly and angrily. Certainly, there will be some kind of a cessation of commemoration at the official level, and it could lead to a disruption in communion. And it's hard to say where the Orthodox churches in the world are going to land. If that happens, then, you know, I think it's important for faithful to try to adopt a Christian habit of charity, of hope, and really of dialogue, because that's the one thing that has disappeared from this entire situation. There used to be dialogues between representatives of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine, the Autocephalous Church, and the Kyivan Patriarchate, and now they have moved away from dialogue. They reject it. You see immediately in the statements made by the Moscow Patriarchate that they have announced that they will not dialogue with the exarchs that Constantinople has sent to Kyiv to prepare for this all-Ukrainian council. So when dialogue disappears, the immediate result is isolation, a lack of understanding, and that isolation breeds both fear and anger. And it creates a distorted image of the person who would be on the other side of the dialogue. So it's kind of hard to find a comforting light in this situation with the possibility that there actually could be a schism that might last for a decade or more. But if there was one, you know, and I apologize for using the metaphor, but I'm really a theologian by training, is that sometimes things have to die in order to rise anew. And what I mean by that is that this post-Soviet period of the church in Ukraine has been one of more fighting than anything else. And it might take a complete break for something new to emerge that will provide hope for the following generations. And so the faithful who are concerned about this, you know, there are lots of things that they can do. They can try to support one another. They can try to support their brothers and sisters in Ukraine. They can try to reach out to those who are on the other side and attempt to initiate dialogue. And the one thing that they always can do is they can attend to life in their local parish. No one can stop a faithful person from attending liturgy, from feeding the hungry, from visiting the sick, from consoling those who are mourning, and from living the Christian life. And if that's all that's left, that's the fullness of the Christian life. So that was a rather long answer to your question, but I had thought about it, and that's where I think we're heading. We're going into a period of uncertainty to some degree. I think we should expect that things will get worse before they get better. But I don't think that we should expect that this is going to stop the process of Constantinople bestowing a Tomos upon a new united church in Ukraine, and for that church to organize its life and to enter into a new epoch of a church that is at least recognized by some of the Orthodox churches in the world. It's hard to say, but I think that any leverage that Moscow had was probably lost when they did not attend that 2016 council in Crete. That was a deep offense to the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And this is what I mean. I think that this is kind of like something that's already in the process of breaking. It's sad and it's unfortunate, but it was already there. A couple of examples. I think that people know the degree to which the Moscow Patriarchate, the way that they have depicted Patriarch Filaret, who, as I think I said in the previous interview, he's a unusually controversial figure. However, whatever one thinks of him, if you look at the entirety of the history, he's been controversial. So, in the interview that Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev granted, and that was published online, he compared what Patriarch Bartholomew is doing now with the acts of then Metropolitan Filaret in 1991 and 92, basically saying that Patriarch Bartholomew is leading the church into schism, and that he's going to go down in history as someone who is stigmatized and delegitimized to the degree that Filaret is. And to add insult to injury, Metropolitan Onufry of Kyiv granted an exclusive interview on Ukrainian TV, and his comments included remarks that the Patriarchate of Constantinople was in some way partially responsible for the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire in 1453, and that the actions that they're taking now are deliberately designed to lead to the fall of the church and society in Ukraine. And I just don't see how making public remarks like that contribute at all to some sense of lingering goodwill. So in other words, the foundations were already cracking because of earlier events in the relations between these churches. And will they completely collapse? It looks quite possible. And if they do, we have to see what emerges from that rubble. Perhaps there will be a new era in church life where both churches might be able to, this is very hopeful and optimistic, but emerge anew and rebuild their relationship. It's going to take a long time, and we are living in a time where we're witnessing to these events happening right before us. So in terms of leverage, I think that their withdrawal from the Holy and Great Council in Crete in 2016 took that away, unless there's some kind of political leverage that they can exert upon the Patriarchate of Constantinople through the relations between Russia and Turkey. And I'm sure you can find experts who are more qualified than me to comment on that. So that's always possible, but on the church scene, I find it unlikely. So both churches have churches that are in their proverbial orbits. So there are churches, for example, the Church of Serbia had close connections with Moscow. Now, what's going to come of it all ultimately? We hope for the best, but we have to expect that there will be a period of time where orthodoxy on the global level is going to have to endure this split. And that might make it difficult at the local level. If people have been praying in one another's churches for some time, this could result in challenges. And I think that you're going to find that some churches are going to do their best to maintain relations with both the Moscow and the Constantinopolitan Patriarchates by taking a neutral stance. I'm hearing that. I'm hearing that from more than one source. So it's certainly going to be interesting, but I think we're going to have to be prepared for some stormy times in the church.